There is a very common misunderstanding that almost everyone falls into after leaving a narcissist. They believe that time will cool everything down, that silence will make them forgotten, that enough distance will make them insignificant, easily replaced, and eventually erased from the other person's mind as if they had never existed. But the reality is far more brutal and far more powerful. To a narcissist, time does not erase you. It transforms you into something they cannot control, cannot understand, and therefore cannot escape. The moment you leave without explanation, without reaction, without giving them an ending they can twist to fit their narrative, you don't end the story, you disrupt it. And the human mind, especially one conditioned to control, cannot tolerate unfinished things. When you stop reacting, you are no longer a person within their system. You become a question mark, a void that cannot be filled, a story that cannot be continued. What unsettles them is not that you left, but how you left. No drama, no return, no opportunity for them to redefine you. Because to them, you were never truly you. You were your reactions to them. And when those reactions disappear completely, what remains is not peace, but disorientation. You do not fade with time. You expand in their mind more distorted, deeper, and harder to control. You are no longer a memory they can edit, but a formless, boundless presence, something that the longer it lingers, the more it destabilizes them. And that is what makes you more dangerous than ever in their world. Stage 1. The illusion of stability. When they believe you have only temporarily disappeared. The first stage is always the most dangerous, not because anything dramatic is happening, but because everything appears so normal that outsiders can completely misread its nature. When you leave in silence, no explanation, no reaction, no return, a narcissist does not experience it as a real loss. They do not go through the kind of shock a typical person would feel when losing a meaningful connection. Instead, they enter a state we can call an illusion of stability, a subtle form of self-reassurance, in which they believe everything is still under control, that the story is not over, that you have merely stepped out of the familiar orbit and will eventually return. This belief does not arise randomly. It is built through repeated past experiences. In their world, people may become angry, hurt, or even leave for a while, but they always come back to talk, to explain, to seek clarity, or simply to close what was left unfinished. And each time that happens, it reinforces an invisible pattern in their mind. No one truly leaves. All distance is temporary. All silence is part of a cycle. So when you disappear without a trace, the first thing they feel is not that they've lost you, it's that they are waiting for you. They continue their life, sometimes appearing calm, stable, and completely unaffected. This is exactly what causes so many people to misunderstand. You see that calmness and assume you never mattered, that you were replaced instantly, that nothing you shared left any mark. But the truth is, there is no processing happening within them at this stage. There is no reflection, no self-questioning, no desire to understand what happened, because within their belief system, nothing has truly ended. When someone does not believe something has ended, they will not begin the process of accepting it. They don't ask, "Why did you leave?" Because they have not acknowledged that you are gone for good. Instead, they place you in a suspended state as if you still exist within their sphere of influence, simply inactive for now. This suspension creates a false sense of stability, a quiet surface masking a process they are completely unaware of. And what's important here is that this stability is not strength, it is delay. It is like a building whose foundation is cracking while the surface still stands, leading those inside to believe everything is safe. They do not prepare for the possibility that you won't return. They do not restructure how they understand the relationship. They do not adjust their expectations because they have never had to before. In all previous experiences, time has always worked in their favor. Time did not take people away. It merely stretched the distance before those people came back. So they learned to believe that time is their ally, that it will automatically repair any rupture without requiring them to change anything. This is an extremely dangerous belief because it makes them dependent on a pattern that reality does not guarantee. When you leave in an unfamiliar way, no reaction, no explanation, no return, you are not just leaving a relationship, you are stepping outside a model they have relied on for a long time. But in this early stage, they do not realize that. They still interpret your actions through old logic, old patterns, conclusions that used to be true in the past. They may think you need time, that you are processing emotions, that you will return once things settle down. These thoughts are not signs of deep care, they are mechanisms protecting their belief system. Because if they were to admit that you might be gone forever, they would have to confront a possibility their system is not designed to handle, that some people exist beyond their control. And instead of facing that possibility, they postpone it through a false sense of certainty. What makes this stage unique is the complete misalignment between reality and perception. While you have truly cut the connection, stopped participating in their system, in their mind, you are still somewhere within orbit, simply not returning yet. And this misalignment becomes the foundation for everything that follows. Because the more time passes without reality matching expectation, the harder it becomes to maintain this illusion of stability. But in the beginning, everything still feels reasonable enough for them not to question it. They can still live, interact, form new connections, and continue forward without sensing that anything is fundamentally wrong. And this is precisely what makes your silence more dangerous to them, because it does not trigger an immediate reaction, but instead quietly accumulates pressure over time. Each day you don't return is a small piece of evidence contradicting their belief. But at this stage, those pieces are still too small to break the system. They only create tiny cracks, almost invisible. And that is the nature of the illusion of stability. It is not true peace, but a pause before awareness begins to shift. To outsiders, it looks like indifference, but in reality, it is waiting. To the person inside it, it feels like certainty, but in truth, it is dependence on a script that once worked, not one that still does. And the most important thing to understand is this. In this stage, you are not forgotten. You are being set aside within a system that still believes you will return. And that belief, although it may seem like it makes you insignificant, is actually what keeps you in their mind in a very particular way. Because when something is believed to be unfinished, it can never be closed. It remains as a process waiting to be completed. And you, in their eyes at this moment, are exactly that, a process. Stage 2, cognitive dissonance, when your silence begins to break their logic. The second stage does not arrive as a clear collapse, but seeps into their awareness quietly, almost impossible to name at first. This is when your silence begins to disrupt the logical system they have relied on for so long to understand the world and control the people around them. At first, they still cling to familiar explanations because the mind naturally protects beliefs that once helped it maintain a sense of safety. They tell themselves that you just need more time, that you are still processing, that you will come back once your emotions settle. These thoughts are not naive. They are a sophisticated defense mechanism designed to prevent their internal structure from collapsing too soon. But time is not negotiable. And with each passing day that you do not return, with every stretch of silence that grows a little longer, their old beliefs are quietly undermined. What makes this stage unique is not what you do, but what you don't do. Because that lack of response creates a form of information they cannot process using their familiar patterns. In the past, whenever instability arose, they could provoke a reaction, create conflict, send a signal, and through your response, regain their sense of control. But now, there is no response, no data to interpret, no behavior to predict. And without data, their reasoning system begins to lose its footing. This is where cognitive dissonance appears, when two realities exist at the same time but cannot be reconciled. On one side is their belief that people always come back, that connections are never truly severed, that they can always regain access. On the other side is the reality that you have left, you are silent, and there is no sign of your return. The mind cannot tolerate this contradiction for long, so it begins to oscillate, sometimes retreating into old beliefs for reassurance, sometimes catching a glimpse that something is no longer true. And this oscillation creates a very specific kind of instability, not strong enough to become panic, but clear enough to fracture the certainty they once had. They may begin to think about you more often, not because they miss you in a deep emotional sense, but because you have become a point of inconsistency in their cognitive system. You are no longer someone they interact with. You have become an undefined variable, an exception they have never had to process before. This forces them to return, again and again, to an unfinished question. What is happening here, and why is this not unfolding the way it used to? What is notable is that they do not easily accept the simplest answer, that you have truly left and will not return, because to accept that, they would have to abandon a crucial part of how they understand themselves and the world. They would have to admit that some people exist beyond their control, that not all connections can be restored, that some endings do not require their permission, and that is a realization too threatening to accept immediately. So they prolong the dissonance, continuing to search for explanations that allow them to hold on to their old beliefs for as long as possible. They may imagine that you are still thinking about them, that you are testing them, that you will return at a more appropriate time. These thoughts are not reality. They are temporary bridges preventing them from confronting the expanding gap in their awareness. But the longer this continues, the weaker those bridges become, because they are not supported by any real evidence. And when a belief is no longer reinforced by reality, it begins to erode from within. This leads to a crucial shift. They start paying more attention to your silence than before. If in the first stage your silence was background noise, temporary and insignificant, it now becomes a focal point, something that demands explanation. You are no longer set aside in their system. You begin to occupy a more central place in their thinking, not because you are doing anything, but because you are doing nothing. And that absence of action creates a cognitive pressure they cannot relieve through familiar methods. They cannot argue with you, cannot persuade you, cannot provoke you into reacting to confirm their place in your mind. And without a response, they cannot be sure whether they still matter to you at all. This directly threatens one of their most fundamental foundations, the belief that they always have influence, that they can always generate a reaction, that they can always leave an imprint on others. When you do not react, you are not just silent, you are negating that ability. But at this stage, that negation is not yet fully conscious. It appears only as a vague feeling that something is slipping out of control. And that vague feeling is the first sign of a shift in power. Before, power lay in their ability to affect you and receive a response. Now, power begins to shift toward you, not because you are trying to control them, but because you have withdrawn from the entire system they depended on to maintain control. You become difficult to understand, impossible to predict, no longer analyzable through old frameworks. And this forces them to face a new reality. Not everything operates according to the model they are used to. And when a model breaks without a replacement, the dissonance continues, creating increasing pressure on their cognitive system. This is the beginning of deeper instability, because when old beliefs are no longer strong enough to explain reality, and new beliefs have not yet formed, they become trapped in an in-between state where everything feels uncertain, unclear, and unpredictable. And in that in-between space, you are no longer part of the past. You become a present problem they cannot solve, a question they cannot answer. And that is what makes you begin to feel more present, in their mind, not as a concrete person, but as a disruption in a logic they once believed could never be wrong. Stage 3, obsession forms, when you become an unfinished loop that cannot close. Stage 3 is where everything begins to shift in a way even they cannot clearly recognize. At this point, you no longer exist as a person in their real life. You begin to exist as an unfinished process in their mind. And it is precisely this lack of closure that creates a very specific kind of obsession. Quiet, not dramatic, but persistent and difficult to escape. When a relationship has a clear ending, no matter how painful, the mind can still close the loop, place it in the past, label it, and move forward. But when you leave without an ending, no explanation, no reaction, no return to complete anything, you do not allow that loop to close. And the brain, which is wired to seek completion, begins to return to that unfinished experience again and again, not because it wants to, but because it cannot stop. This is the point where you shift from a memory into a process, from a person into a question. And a question without an answer always holds more power than any story that has already ended. They begin to think about you more, but the way they think is no longer grounded in reality. When you were present, they could interact with you, adjust their perception of you based on your responses, devalue you when necessary, or elevate you when it suited their needs. But now, there is no feedback to recalibrate, no new data to update. Everything begins to be reconstructed internally without verification from reality. Old conversations are remembered but no longer accurately. Details are added or removed to fit the narrative they are trying to build. Emotions are amplified or minimized depending on their psychological state at any given moment. And over time, a paradox emerges. You become larger in their mind than you ever were in real life. Not because you have changed, but because reality's limits are gone. When you were present, you had flaws, contradictions, imperfect reactions, and those helped keep you within a frame they could control. But once you are gone, those limits disappear. You become an image that can be stretched in any direction their mind needs in order to manage internal tension. At times, you are idealized, the one who understood them most, the most special person, the one they lost. At other times, you are devalued, blamed, turned into the cause of the rupture as a way to protect their sense of self. But none of these versions are stable, because all of them are temporary attempts to answer a question they cannot resolve. And it is this instability that keeps the obsession alive. You are no longer a static memory, you are a dynamic system, constantly shifting, constantly reinterpreted, but never reaching a conclusion. This creates a mental loop where the same theme returns in different forms each time, with slightly different emotions, slightly different perspectives, but never enough to close the story. And the absence of closure strengthens the loop, because every return reinforces the feeling that something is still unresolved. This is not love in any deep sense, nor is it healthy attachment. It is the result of unresolved tension combined with psychological incompletion. They are not obsessed with you as a real person. They are obsessed with the gap you left behind, with a disruption in a model they cannot repair. And because they cannot interact with you to resolve it, they are forced inward into a space where everything becomes less stable, less controlled. Another key element in this stage is the emergence of comparison. As they enter new interactions or relationships, they do not begin from a neutral state, but from a system already disrupted by your absence. The new people they encounter are not seen on their own terms. They are measured against a version of you that has been reshaped over time. And because that version is no longer constrained by reality, it can become more idealized, deeper, or even more extreme than who you actually were. This creates an invisible standard that no one can fully meet, because that standard is not based on reality, but on an unfinished, ever-changing, unverifiable image. And each time this comparison occurs, whether consciously or not, it pulls you back into their mind, not as a choice, but as a reference point they cannot eliminate. This is where the obsession deepens. It is no longer just direct thoughts about you, but the way you begin to shape how they experience everything else. You become part of their cognitive system, not as a memory of the past, but as a factor still shaping their present. And what makes this powerful is that you are doing nothing to maintain it. You are not sending signals, not keeping contact, not participating in any interaction. Your presence in their mind is generated entirely by their own internal system and therefore lies outside their direct control. They cannot ask you to stop. They cannot argue with you. They cannot receive feedback to recalibrate their perception. You become a self-sustaining process in their mind, and the longer it continues, the deeper it embeds. This is the central paradox of this stage. The more absent you are in reality, the more present you become in their mind. Not as a concrete person, but as an unfinished loop, an unanswered question, an unresolved experience. And while they continue their life externally, internally, a process is unfolding that they cannot stop through willpower alone, because it is not sustained by conscious choice, but by the very structure of how the mind processes what remains incomplete. And at this point, you are no longer simply part of their past. You become an active force, shaping their present in ways they cannot fully see, but cannot escape. Stage 4, collapse of control, when they can no longer rewrite the story of you. Stage 4 is where a structural shift begins to take place. It no longer remains at the level of emotions or repetitive thoughts, but moves directly into what a narcissist depends on most to maintain themselves: the ability to control the narrative. When you were still involved, they didn't just interact with you, they continuously rewrote you. Every action, every reaction, every word of yours could be reinterpreted in a way that served the image they needed to maintain. If they needed to feel superior, you became the one who was wrong. If they needed to feel desired, you became indispensable. If they needed to avoid responsibility, you became the cause of every problem. You did not exist as a fixed entity in their mind. You existed as a flexible version, adjustable according to their psychological needs at any given moment. And that flexibility created the illusion that they were always in control, not just of you, but of the reality they were living in. But when you disappear completely, no response, no participation, no input for that interpretive process, something critical is severed. They lose the ability to update the story. It is not that they don't want to rewrite you, it is that they can't. Because to rewrite a narrative, they need new data, new reactions, new interactions to adjust, distort, or reinforce a particular version. But you are no longer there to provide anything, and without new input, every attempt at interpretation becomes repetitive, rigid, and gradually ineffective. They may continue to label you as wrong, weak, unworthy, but those labels are no longer reinforced by present reality. They become repeated statements in a space with no feedback. And over time, even they begin to feel the uncertainty within those interpretations. This is the point where control begins to collapse, not because you actively resist them, but because you are no longer participating in the system that allowed them to maintain that control. You become a point of stillness within a system that depends on constant movement. And when a system built on continuous change encounters something that cannot be changed, it begins to destabilize. You can no longer be redefined over time. You no longer react to confirm or deny any version they create. And this produces what can be called a cognitive freeze. In their mind, you are held at the last state in which they could still interact with you, but that state is not enough to form a complete narrative. It lacks an ending, lacks confirmation, lacks the agreement they need to seal a version of you. And so you become an image that cannot be completed, cannot be edited, cannot be controlled. This is profoundly unsettling for someone accustomed to adjusting everything to fit their needs. Because for the first time, they are faced with something that exists outside their capacity to manipulate. They cannot provoke you to prove you are still affected. They cannot bring you back to restore access. They cannot make you say anything they can latch onto to continue rewriting the story. You become a shaped absence, a presence that cannot be touched, and that completely disrupts how they once understood power. Before, their power lay in their ability to alter perception, to reshape the narrative until it served them. But now the story stops, not ends, but is interrupted. And an interrupted story cannot be controlled in the usual way because it has no ending to fix its meaning. This leads to a deeper consequence. They begin to gradually lose confidence in their own ability to interpret. Not suddenly, not obviously, but subtly. Each time they try to define you without new evidence to support it, they feel a small uncertainty. Each time they repeat an old narrative without your feedback, it becomes slightly less convincing. And these slight shifts accumulate over time, creating a quiet erosion of their sense of control. What matters is that they cannot resolve this in familiar ways. They cannot confront you, persuade you, or manipulate you because you are no longer there to engage. And without interaction, they cannot close the story on their terms. You exist in their mind like a sentence cut off midway. No period, no explanation, no confirmation. And it is precisely this lack of completion that renders all control attempts ineffective. This is when they begin to face a form of helplessness they are not used to. Not helplessness in action, but helplessness in interpretation. They no longer know how to think about you in a way that restores stability. They no longer know where to place you within their narrative so that everything makes sense again. And when they cannot place you clearly, the entire structure they use to understand relationships begins to shake. Because that system is built on the assumption that people can always be defined, categorized, and controlled through their reactions. But you no longer react, and when something no longer follows the rules of the system, it doesn't just exist outside it, it exposes the limits of that system. You become living proof that some things cannot be rewritten, some people cannot be defined at will, and some stories cannot be controlled from beginning to end. And it is this, not anything you actively do, but your unmanipulable absence that truly causes their control to collapse. Stage 5. Replacement fails. When the new person cannot fill the space you left behind, stage 5 is where one of their most fundamental beliefs begins to crack, not loudly or obviously, but quietly, gradually, and in a way that becomes harder and harder to deny. The belief that anyone can be replaced. In a narcissist system, people do not exist as independent individuals with their own depth, but as interchangeable roles, sources of emotion, reaction, and validation. When someone leaves, they do not truly lose a person. They lose a function. And according to that logic, a function can always be filled by someone else. So on the surface, they may move very quickly into a new relationship, recreating the same familiar script: initial attraction, intense connection, a sense of uniqueness, followed by control, definition, and the repetition of old patterns. From the outside, everything appears smooth, even convincing others that you have been completely replaced, that your position was never unique. But what the surface does not reveal is the misalignment unfolding underneath. Because while behaviors can be repeated, the psychological structure formed within each relationship cannot be perfectly replicated. You were not just a role in their system. You were the result of a specific sequence of interactions, particular reactions, specific conflicts, unresolved moments, all forming a unique imprint that no one else can reproduce exactly. And most importantly, you left without closing that position. You did not provide a clear ending that would allow them to close your role and transfer it to someone else. Instead, you left behind an unfinished space, a crack in the system that they never had the chance to repair. When someone new enters, they may fill the surface, but they cannot reach the deeper level where that crack exists. And this is where replacement begins to fail, not in the sense that they cannot continue a new relationship, but in the sense that they cannot recreate the internal stability they once had before you left. New interactions do not feel the same. They do not trigger the same responses. They do not reinforce the same beliefs. There are small moments, very small, where something feels off but cannot be clearly identified. A response that does not feel familiar. A reaction that does not provide the same validation. A silence that is not filled in the way they expect. And in those moments, you begin to return not as a clear memory, but as a vague reference point. They may not consciously think about you, but they experience the difference through you. The new person does not respond the way you once did, does not move in the same rhythm, does not create the same flow they had grown accustomed to. And this is not because the new person is worse or better, but because they are different. And that difference exposes the truth. You were not easily replaceable. The paradox is that you become more present in your absence. Not because they are intentionally holding on to you, but because their system cannot fully remove you. You become an unspoken standard, a silent point of comparison that always exists. And because you left without closure, that standard is no longer constrained by reality. It can be idealized, reshaped, elevated over time, while the new person always exists within reality, with limitations, imperfections, and flaws. This creates an imbalance that no new relationship can fully resolve. They may continue moving forward, but with a subtle sense of lack, a dissatisfaction without a clear source, a gap between expectation and actual experience. And that gap is where you exist, not as someone to return to, but as something unresolved that continues to shape how they experience the present. The more they try to replace you, the more they unintentionally reveal that something cannot be replaced. And this gradually weakens one of their most important defense mechanisms, the belief that they can always find someone else to restore balance. When that belief erodes, they do not just lose certainty in relationships, they lose a part of their sense of control over life itself. Because if not everyone can be replaced, if some people can leave and leave behind an imprint that cannot be erased, then it means they are not fully in control of how things unfold. And that is the deepest point of this stage. The failure is not in the new person. It is in the old system no longer functioning the way it once did. You do not need to compete, prove anything, or return to win. By simply not coming back, you reveal that there are spaces that cannot be filled through simple replacement. And in that revelation, power continues to shift, not because you are doing anything, but because you have stepped outside a system that depended on you staying. Stage 6, Symbolization. When you are no longer a person but become meaning. Stage 6 is the point where everything moves beyond the realm of personal memory and enters a deeper layer where you are no longer processed as a concrete person, but become a symbol carrying meaning within their psychological system. This is not about them remembering you more clearly. On the contrary, details begin to fade. Specific conversations, particular situations, distinct emotions gradually lose their sharpness. But what remains is not emptiness, it is condensation. You are no longer remembered for what you did, you are remembered for what you represent. And what you represent is not neutral. You become the symbol of a limit they had never been forced to face before, a point where their familiar mechanisms no longer function as they once did. When an experience cannot be fully explained, cannot be closed with a clear narrative, it does not disappear, it compresses into meaning. And meaning does not need detail to exist. It exists as a feeling, an implicit awareness, an imprint embedded deep within how they understand the world. You are no longer the person who left. You become the person who can leave and not return. This distinction may seem subtle, but psychologically, it completely changes your position. A person can be forgotten, replaced, diminished over time, But a symbol does not depend on physical presence or precise memory. It exists as a reference point, a pattern that reactivates whenever similar situations arise. And because of that, you begin to appear in their system not by their choice, but through the automatic functioning of their mind. Whenever a new relationship becomes uncertain, whenever there is distance, whenever silence appears, a familiar feeling emerges not as a clear memory of you, but as a signal that something may be slipping beyond control. And that signal is you, not you as a person, but you as meaning embedded in a past experience. What makes this stage profound is that you are no longer pulled back and forth between idealization and devaluation as before. In earlier stages, they try to define you in different ways to regain stability, sometimes elevating you, sometimes diminishing you, as a way to control their perception. But once you become a symbol, that fluctuation begins to fade. You are no longer an object of debate in their mind. You become a fixed reference point, not fixed in detail, but fixed in meaning. You are the place where something did not unfold as expected, where their system encountered a limit it could not overcome. And because of that, you begin to influence how they perceive everything else, not directly, but through how you have altered their understanding of their own control. Before, they could believe that every relationship would eventually return to a familiar orbit, that every distance could be closed, that every silence could be broken with the right move. But you are proof that this is not always the case. And this proof does not need to be constantly recalled to exist. It remains in the background of their awareness, shaping how they interpret new situations without requiring conscious recognition. This is the power of becoming a symbol. You do not need to be present to have influence. A person requires interaction to remain relevant, but a symbol does not. It becomes integrated into the way the psychological system organizes meaning. And once integrated, it is no longer a separate object, but part of the lens through which everything is seen. This also explains why, over time, you may become more unsettling to them, not because they think of you more often, but because what you represent begins to touch deeper layers of how they understand themselves and the world. You are no longer a memory that can be adjusted. You are a reality they have experienced and cannot fully deny. And that reality raises a question they cannot easily answer. If someone can leave and never return, what does that say about their ability to control? But rather than confronting that question directly, their system tends to hold it in symbolic form, because symbols allow something to exist without needing full explanation. They can be felt without being articulated, can influence without being clearly recognized, and this is what makes you more enduring within their system. You no longer depend on specific memories to exist, so as time blurs the details, you do not weaken. You become more condensed. You are no longer scattered across small contradictions or minor details. You are distilled into a core meaning, and that meaning continues to operate, continues to influence, continues to reappear in new situations they encounter. This is the point where you truly move beyond a specific relationship and become part of their cognitive structure. Not the center, but an element they cannot fully remove. And the important thing to understand is that this process does not happen because you tried to create it. It happens because you did not give them a way to end the story on their terms. When a story is not finished, it does not disappear, it transforms. And in that transformation, it may become more abstract, but also more powerful. You are no longer a chapter in their story. You become an underlying principle that shapes how they write the chapters that follow. And that is why, at this stage, you no longer need to do anything to exist in their mind. You are no longer someone who needs to be remembered. You have become a meaning they cannot fully escape. Stage 7. Internal instability. When your absence begins to shake their very sense of self. Stage 7 is the point where everything no longer revolves around you, but turns inward into their own internal structure. Here, your absence is no longer just an event. It becomes a force that exposes weaknesses that were always there but had never been touched. This is not a loud collapse, not the kind of crisis outsiders can easily recognize. It is a quiet, prolonged instability, embedded deep in how they experience themselves. Before you left, their sense of self was maintained through a continuous stream of interactions where they could adjust, control, and reaffirm their position through the reactions of others. They never had to ask who they were independently, because the answer was always reflected back from the outside. But when you fully withdrew, you didn't just leave the relationship, you removed one of the reflective surfaces they relied on to stabilize their identity. And this creates a gap they cannot easily identify, yet constantly feel. At first, they may try to maintain the old image, continuing other relationships, repeating familiar behaviors, relying on patterns that once gave them a sense of control. But over time, a misalignment begins to form between the image they try to sustain and what they actually experience. Because somewhere within their system, there now exists a piece of evidence they cannot erase. There was someone who left and did not return. There was a point where their influence stopped and was never restored. And that evidence does not need to be constantly recalled to have an effect. It exists as a crack within their cognitive structure, a point where their belief in control is no longer absolute. What makes this stage profound is that fragmentation begins to occur. One part of them still clings to the old narrative, still wants to believe they are unaffected, that you didn't matter, that everything remains under control. Another part begins to sense instability, a discomfort without a clear source, a subtle uncertainty they cannot explain through familiar patterns. And these two parts do not fully align. They coexist, sometimes conflicting, sometimes overlapping, creating a state they cannot easily name but cannot ignore. This is the essence of internal instability, not total collapse, but a loss of synchronization between different layers of the self. They may still act confidently, still speak with certainty, still maintain the familiar image in front of others, but internally there is a fluctuation they cannot fully control. And that fluctuation does not come from anything you are doing. It comes from what you did not do. You did not return to restore the old model. You did not react to reaffirm their role. You did not give them the opportunity to repair, explain, or reestablish control. You left behind a boundary they cannot cross, and that boundary becomes part of how they understand themselves. Before, they could believe that any disruption could be repaired, any distance could be closed, any person could be pulled back in one way or another. But you are the exception. And an exception, when it cannot be integrated into the system, does not disappear. It remains as a point of interference. Each time they encounter a similar situation, distance, silence, uncertainty, in a new relationship, that feeling returns, not as a clear memory of you, but as a vague awareness that something may fall outside their control. And even if subtle, even if unspoken, that awareness is enough to alter their responses. They may become more defensive, more controlling, or, conversely, more avoidant, because on some level they have learned that not everything returns to the way it was. What matters is that this instability does not necessarily lead to clear positive or negative change. It simply means the system no longer runs as smoothly as before. There is a slight delay in reaction, a small hesitation in belief, a subtle gap between what they want to believe and what they have experienced. And these small shifts, accumulated over time, create a much larger transformation in how they perceive the world. You are no longer the center of this change, but you are its origin. Not because you tried to create impact, but because the way you left forced their system to confront something it could not resolve using its old methods. And this is where the deepest paradox appears. You do not need to exist in their life to continue having influence. You do not need to be clearly remembered, mentioned, or present. Your absence has already been recorded within their structure, not as a memory, but as a limit. And that limit continues to shape how they feel, respond, and interpret future experiences. This is not power in the usual sense. It is not about controlling them or making them think about you. It is a passive, deep influence that comes from your withdrawal from their system. And the most important thing to understand is this. This stage is not about them losing or you winning. It is about a structure being altered, a belief being cracked, a certainty no longer intact. You did not destroy them. You simply revealed something they could no longer hide. That they are not omnipotent in controlling people or outcomes. And when a system built on a sense of omnipotence encounters its limits, it does not collapse immediately, but it will never be as stable as it once was. And in the end, after everything that has unfolded, what matters most is not what you became in their mind, but what you freed yourself from in your own life. Because this entire process, from the illusion of stability to cognitive dissonance, obsession, collapse of control, failed replacement, symbolization, and internal instability, was never truly about you winning against a narcissist. It simply reveals a truth you may not have clearly seen before, that the system only exists as long as you participate in it. You do not become stronger by arguing better. You do not become free by explaining more clearly. And you are not validated by trying to be right in the eyes of someone who needs you to be wrong in order to feel stable. Your real power begins the moment you stop providing reactions. Stop engaging in the loop. Stop trying to complete a story that was never designed to end fairly. And when you do that, a paradox occurs. You do not disappear from their world. You become something they cannot complete. But that no longer matters, because your true value is not in whether you still exist in their mind. It is in the fact that you are no longer trapped in how they see you. You no longer need them to understand you. You no longer need their recognition. You no longer need them to rewrite the story so that you can feel seen. You close what they never could. And that is the deepest shift of all. From trying to become the right version of yourself within their story, to leaving that story entirely and beginning to write your life in a way that does not require external validation. In the end, your silence is not a strategy, it is a boundary. Not to make them remember you, but so that you no longer have to forget yourself. And if there is one thing to carry forward from all of this, it is this. You do not need to become unforgettable in someone else's mind to prove your worth. You only need to become no longer dependent on being understood correctly by the wrong person. When you reach that point, you do not just leave a person, you leave a system that once required you to trade yourself just to exist within it. And that is not a loss. That is a return